you everybody for joining us. My name is Jiyae Hwang. I'm an associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the TN visa requirements, including one of the most common questions we encounter, which is, does a TN visa require sponsorship? As many of you may know, the TN visa is available for Canadian and Mexican nationals and can be one of the fastest ways you can get work authorization in the United States. So just a few things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration law firm. Our founder, Ian Scott, is a Canadian national, actually, and has personal experience navigating the TN visa as well, so we know exactly what you are going through. We do assist individuals pursuing various types of visas, including family-based, employment-based immigration. So whatever your immigration needs may be, we can help you. So including the TN visa, we regularly process a high number of TN visas, and we will be happy to help with your case. So we are continuing this webinar series, and we are doing at least 2 webinars a month on a different variety of immigration law topics. So please feel free to sign up for any future webinars. At the end of this webinar, we will be sending out a few things to all participants. First, we will be sending you a copy of the PowerPoint that has all the information we will be sharing today. Second, we will be sharing you a comprehensive TN visa guide that you can use as a reference. We will also send you a link where you can sign up for the additional upcoming webinars in the future, and also a link to this webinar as it will be recorded. We will also share this webinar on YouTube, and we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel because we do upload a variety of immigration law related videos, not only the webinars. Finally, we will also send you a link where you could follow to set up a consultation with one of our experienced attorneys, should you wish to discuss your case further. So today, we are very lucky to have Dustin Saldarriaga, who is a senior associate at the firm with a wealth of TN visa experience, who has processed a high number of TN visas, and who will be answering these commonly found questions on the TN visa requirements today. Finally, for any questions you may have, please do feel free to add them to the chat box or use the Q&A function, and we will try and get to all questions. So without further ado, Dustin, please feel free to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jiyae, for the introduction, and thank you to you all for taking the time to join us today for our webinar on the TN visa. This really is one of the more common visas that we help our clients with. And for our clients, when someone comes to us and they're a national of Canada or Mexico and they want to work in the US, really the TN is going to be one of the first things we would usually consider. So let's start by going over what the requirements for a TN visa are. First of all, you must be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. And that's because the TN visa is rooted in the North America Free Trade Agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Your profession, the profession that you're coming to the US to perform, must appear on the list of professions that's in the TN regulations. And when I say the TN regulations, what I mean is you actually, it might be worth pulling these up right now if you're in front of a computer rather than watching this on your phone. If you Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations, and you look at what comes up, you'll see in the regulations that there are a number of jobs that are listed, starting with accountant, and then architect, computer systems analyst, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll be referring to those regulations through the presentation today. But the job that you're coming to the US to do must be listed in those regulations. You must be qualified to practice that profession. And again, the qualification is listed in the regulations. So if you look at accountant, you see baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA, and those are all licenses for accountants. So what this means is basically if you're coming to the US to work as an accountant, you need to either have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or one of those licenses that's listed there. And again, the qualifications differ for each of the professions. So you do need to first find your profession and then make sure you have those qualifications. Fourth on the list on your screen, you must have a pre-arranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. So you need to be coming to the US to perform one of these professions. You need to be qualified to perform the profession, and you need to have an offer from a US employer for that role. So the TN visa is not meant to come to the US to find one of those jobs. You really should have the job lined up where basically you just need to get the visa or be admitted if you're a Canadian in TN status to begin work for that employer. And we'll talk more about that through the presentation. And finally, in that job, you need to be employed to actually engage in the professional activities that are consistent with the profession. So what does this mean? Basically, to take an example, you cannot be coming to the US to work with the job title of accountant, where in fact you're doing some other kind of work. Where this comes up a lot is, for example, in marketing. Many people want to come to the US to help a US company with its marketing. This person might be good at using social media, pulling together videos, things like that. Marketing really doesn't have a category in the TN regulations. So you do, if you're going to do that, you need to be creative about figuring out what category you're in. But let's stick with our example of accountant. You've gotten a job offer to come to the US as an accountant. How can you know what an accountant actually does? But more importantly, how can you be sure what the government thinks an accountant does? Because at the end of the day, you're going to be applying for a TN visa either at a consulate or at the border, and we'll talk about those two options later. So, if you're trying to show the government that you actually are coming to the US to work as an accountant, you need to know what the government thinks an accountant does. So to figure that out, there is something that the government publishes called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and it's published by the US Department of Labor. So if you Google OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, and then just to take the example of accountant, you will see a page. It's the first link that comes up for me and probably for you as well. You'll see a page with a few tabs at the top, summary, and then the second tab is what they do. If you click on what they do, you actually see a list of the job duties for accountants. And so if you Google OOH accountant, click on that link and look at the tab what they do, you'll see that accountants, in the eyes of the government, what the government thinks an accountant does is examine financial statements to ensure that they're accurate and comply with laws and regulations, compute taxes owed, prepare tax returns, ensure that taxes are paid properly, inspect account books and accounting systems, organize, analyze, and maintain financial records, etc., etc. So if you're approaching a border, talking with a border officer, you're at the consulate applying for a TN visa, and you say, I'm coming to the US to work as an accountant, you want to make sure that the job duties that you're going to be doing are aligned with what is actually listed here on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And of course, you would do this for your specific profession. If you're coming to work as a lawyer, you'd look at what the job duties are that the government thinks a lawyer performs. Now, this is very important. It's very important to be honest, obviously. So, if a US employer wants you to be coming to the US to actually do marketing, you can't simply make up job duties based on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, present those to the government. You actually need to be doing these job duties in your role. So, have a discussion with your US employer and really do try to make sure that the job duties you'll be doing in the US are aligned with what the government thinks the job entails. So let's get to what sponsorship is. So again, this is the title of our presentation today. And the reason we title our presentation around this question of whether sponsorship is required for TN employment is because it really is, as Jiyae said, one of the most common questions we get in the TN visa context. So let's start by defining sponsorship. Sponsorship is usually used in the green card context. To get a green card in the US, you need to be sponsored by either usually a family member or by an employer. And basically, that family member or that employer is saying that the applicant, the person who's applying for a green card, is in fact being sponsored by me as their relative or as their employer. And there are responsibilities that come with that. Whether as an employer, you are going to be employing them, and you're going to be paying them the amount that you say you will, and you've tested the job market. If you're a family member, there might be an obligation to show that you're providing financial support for your family member abroad who's coming in on an immigrant visa or applying for a green card. Now, sponsorship is also used to describe the employer's obligations for certain non-immigrant visas, such as the H-1B visa. This is a very common example because the H-1B, if you're going to sponsor someone, if you're an employer sponsoring someone to come to the US to work for you on an H-1B, you need to pay them the prevailing wage, which is usually higher than minimum wage. You also have certain obligations if you fire them. Excuse me. You may need to pay for their transportation back home. You need to make sure that they are actually being employed. You can't have someone come on an H-1B visa and then not actually work. That's called benching, and that is prohibited in the regulations. The TN visa has none of these requirements. So what we would typically respond to the question of if an employer came to us and said, I want someone to work for me as a TN worker, do I need to sponsor them? The answer is actually no. The TN visa has no prevailing wage. There actually is no required wage for a TN visa. Obviously, you need to comply with the minimum wage requirements. You can't pay someone below the federally mandated or the state mandated minimum wage. But that's very different from a prevailing wage, which is usually significantly higher than minimum wage. Also, there's no requirement that you actually pay them the amount that you say you will in the employer letter. That's, we'll talk about the employment letter later in the presentation, but you actually are not obligated by contract to pay the TN worker a certain amount. You also don't need to pay for their transportation back home. You're not actually even required to continue employing them if they are an at-will employee, meaning they can quit and you can fire them. This is what we call at-will employment. So, the obligations on the TN employer are minimal. So let's talk about one distinction. You see it on the third bullet on the screen, and that is, what if you're applying within the US? So let's take a quick step back. If you're applying for a TN visa, there are really two main pathways to do that. The first is applying at a consulate. And nationals of Mexico must apply for a TN visa at a consulate. Nationals of Canada have the option to apply for a TN visa at a consulate, but they can also apply at a port of entry. In other words, they can actually drive to the border between Canada and the United States, or between Mexico and the United States. And if they have a Canadian passport, they can provide their TN visa application there. Nationals of Mexico cannot do that. They actually need to go to the consulate, get the visa beforehand, and then enter the US on that visa. If you are applying for a TN visa as a Canadian at a port of entry, and I use the term TN visa, technically it's TN status, but if you're applying at the port of entry, you are the applicant as the employee. So you as the employee are providing your application at the port of entry, whether that's a land crossing or an airport, for example. And if your application is approved, you are approved. If your application is denied, that denial is your denial. Contrast this to if you are applying within the United States. So if you are in the US, say, as a student on an F1 visa or on a tourist visa, and you you have a conversation with an employer in the US and they say, hey, we'd love to hire you as a TN worker. You can apply for TN status from within the US. That's true of both nationals of Mexico and nationals of Canada. If you file an application within the US, that is called a change of status, then it is the employer who is applying. Again, the responsibilities on the employer are still minimal. However, the employer does need to be the one to sign the application. And if the application is approved or denied, technically it is the employer who is approved or denied for the TN change of status. So that's a distinction. If the employee is already in the U.S. applying for a change of status with USCIS, it is technically the employer who is applying for the TN status. Again, it's a distinction. It doesn't really create any additional obligations on the employer. So, we do have conversations with employers to explain this to them. Many employers are understandably hesitant. They don't want to be burdened with, significant responsibilities as there would be, say, in the green card context or the H-1B context. The TN does not create those obligations. So let's move on to differences for Canadians and Mexican nationals. I already talked about the broad differences. The main difference is where Canadians and Mexicans can apply. Both Canadians and Mexicans can apply at a consulate. Only Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Another difference is that Canadians can receive a TN visa that's issued for 3 years. In other words, status. If they come into the US and TN status, they will usually be granted status for 3 years, assuming that the job requires that. In other words, if you're coming in to work for an employer and the employer says, we only need this person for a year, you're only going to get status for a year. But the maximum amount you can receive is 3 years. One other point regarding Canadians is if the spouse is not a national of Canada, the spouse must go to the consulate to get their spousal TN visa, which is called a TD visa. So spouses can apply if someone comes into the US on a TN visa and they are married, the spouse can get what's called a TD visa. And children can also get a TD visa. Again, if the spouse or the children are not nationals of Canada, they do need to go to a consulate. They cannot apply at a port of entry. Nationals of Mexico, again, must apply at a US consulate. In the past, TN visas were issued for nationals of Mexico for only a year. Fortunately, last year this was changed. So you do have the option to pay an additional fee at the consulate and receive a TN visa for 4 years. That is recommended because as long as your employment lasts 4 years, in other words, the employer expects to employ you for 4 years, there's no reason to need to keep going to the consulate. So we would usually recommend paying that higher fee, get the visa for 4 years, and not have to worry about going back to the consulate. Each time you enter the US on your visa, if you're a national of Mexico, you can be given up to 3 years of status. So even if you have a 4-year visa, your status in the US each time you enter is only going to be for a maximum of 3 years. So that means you need to travel at the end of that 3-year period, re-enter on the TN visa, and you'd be given status again to come into the US and continue your employment. If you are applying to renew your TN visa as a national of Mexico, the consulates in Mexico will sometimes allow you to do that by mail rather than showing up in person, but that would depend on the consulate, and they'll let you know if they'll allow you to do that. I do see a question: if the Mexican national applies at a consulate, it's the applicant who signs the application, not the employer. So if you're applying at a consulate, the application would be in your name as the employee. The employer would not technically be the applicant as they would be if you're applying within the US at USCIS. We'll talk more in a few minutes about what a TN application includes, what documents you need to have, and there are pieces of that application that the employer will need to sign, but we'll talk about that in just a minute. All right, let's shift to, you know what, before we get into this, why don't we talk about what is included in the application? I think that'd be helpful at this point. So when you're applying for a TN visa, the main pieces of the application are going to be, if we go back to that first slide that shows the requirements. So you need to prove that you're a citizen of Mexico or Canada. So obviously you're going to need your passport. You also are going to need to show that you are qualified to practice a profession. So again, you'd go to the regulations and you'd see, does it require a degree? Does it require experience? And you're going to need to include in your application proof that you satisfy the qualification requirement. For example, if you're saying I'm coming in as an accountant because I have a baccalaureate degree in accounting, then you need to have the original diploma with you. That needs to be included in the application. Why the original? Because border officials encounter a lot of fraud. And we are aware of border officers regularly rejecting copies of these documents. So you want to have original documents and you want to have original signatures when you're applying for the TN. Passport, proof of your qualification, whether that is an original diploma or if you're applying based on experience. We'll talk about certain professions that do allow experience. You need to have proof that you have the relevant experience. That could be letters from past employers that are signed with the original signatures from your past employers. But that is the second category of documentation that you need, proof that you qualify. You also need to have proof that you have a prearranged job with a US employer. So what does that look like? This is what we call the employer letter. Your US employer needs to write a letter addressed to the government that you will bring with you to the consulate or to the port of entry. That explains who they are as the employer, why they need someone employed in the role that you will be filling, who you are, why you're qualified to fill that role, why your background is important for the employer, and specifically talking about what your job duties at the company will be and for how long they need to employ you and how much they'll pay you. Basically details about the job arrangement. So that employer letter does need to be on the company's letterhead of the US employer. It also needs to have the contact information for the person who is signing the letter so that the government can contact them if they have any questions. And they do sometimes reach out to the employer during the interview. So you want to make sure that the employer is available to speak with the government. And it needs to have the original signature of the person who wrote the letter. Again, original signatures are important to get, so don't rely on a copy. You don't want to put a lot of time into traveling to the consulate, traveling to the port of entry, only to have the officer reject your application because you don't have an original signature or an original document. So err on the side of caution and always have originals. So that is what the application packet looks like when you're applying for a TN. And really, it's the same whether you're a national of Canada or a national of Mexico, and it's the same whether you're applying at a consulate or at a port of entry. If you're applying to change status within the US, the application does look a little bit different. You would include everything that I just described. You can use copies if you're applying through USCIS. So if you're already within the US applying for a change of status, you do not need to provide original signatures. You do not need to provide your original diploma, for example. You can provide copies, but you would include all of the documents that I just described. In addition, you would file what's called a Form I-129, which is the USCIS form for someone who is applying for status as a worker in the US. So that would be a USCIS application packet. So let's go back to what we were talking about or about to shift to before. Let's talk about some difficult TN categories. And as we talk through this, I'll apply some of the things that I shared before about using the regulations, using the Occupational Outlook handbook. So probably the most challenging TN professional category is management consultants. And the reason for that is that almost all TN visa categories require some kind of educational background or a license. If you have not gone to university, then you are limited to extremely few TN professional categories. One of them is the management consulting category. So this category attracts a lot of people largely because they don't have a college degree. And the government is aware of that. And so they always will scrutinize a management consultant application. So how do you qualify as a management consultant? If you pull up the regulations, again, Google NAFTA, TN regulations, and you look at management consultant, then you will see that you can qualify by having a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So that's the first way, by having a degree, or by having equivalent professional experience, i.e. 5 years of experience as either a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. This is extremely broad because let's look at those two pieces. 5 years of experience as a management consultant. So that means, the large consulting firms are helpful to think about. Bain Consulting, McKinsey. These are companies where, the employee, the management consultant, will visit a client and will advise them on addressing a specific problem. So if you have 5 years of experience working for a consulting firm, that's a relatively easy application. That would not be considered a risky management consultant application. What is a risky management consultant application is if you're coming to the US to work as a management consultant for a company that is not a management consulting firm. I like to use an example to show what this looks like. If the US employer is a manufacturer and retailer, a seller of solar panels, and you are a national of Canada with extensive experience with solar panels, making them, selling them, improving the supply chain, you are just a guru on solar panels, you could apply within the management consultant category. That would be considered a risky application because you would be coming to the US to work for a solar panel company, not for a management consulting company. So how would you structure that? Let's assume that you don't have a baccalaureate degree, you don't have a licenciatura degree. What you would need to do to qualify for the management consultant role is to show that you have those 5 years of experience in a field of specialty that's related to the consulting agreement. In our example, that would be solar panels. So how would you, that gets you past the qualification stage, right? You would not be looking at the college degree, you'd entirely be looking at experience. So how could you structure the application so that it's a little less risky than it might be otherwise? What you have to show is, first of all, in the employer letter, they need to make it clear what the specific challenge that they are facing is, and how you, as a management consultant, are coming into the US to specifically address that challenge. You are not coming into the US to fill a role at the company that existed before. Again, think about the management consultant role. When you hire a management consulting firm to address a problem at your company, that consultant's not coming in to be employed and receive a salary from your company. They are coming in as an outside consultant to address a specific problem. When that problem's solved, they're going to leave. That's what the role needs to look like for a management consultant TN position. On your screen, you see in the third bullet below management consultant, you see that the position must be supernumerary. That's not a word we use often, but what it basically means is exactly what I'm explaining. This cannot be a permanent role at the company that the person's coming in to fill. It needs to be outside of their normal roles to address a problem, and then they're leaving. So, again, what kinds of things I keep referring to, like what a management consultant usually does. So how do I know what the government thinks a management consultant does? The Occupational Outlook Handbook. And again, when your employer, the US employer, is drafting the employer letter describing what you're going to be doing when you come to the US, it needs to be aligned with what the government thinks a management consultant does. So if we Google OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, management consultant, the government uses the title management analyst, and then you click what they do, the tab at the top, you see a management analyst gathers and organizes information about the problems to be solved or the procedures to be improved. They interview personnel, conduct on-site observations to determine methods, equipment, and personnel that will be needed. They analyze financial and other data. They develop solutions. They recommend new systems, procedures, or organizational changes. They make recommendations, and they confer with managers to ensure that changes are working. So again, that is what, when you imagine what McKinsey does, that's what they do. They show up, they study the problem, they talk with management, they make recommendations, they see if the recommendations are actually making a difference. So that's what the TN management consultant also needs to show in the employer letter. The other challenging category for TN status is economists. And the reason for this is very different from management consultants. The reason is that in 2017, the government issued a memorandum, a policy memorandum, that basically explicitly narrowed what would be considered for the job duties that would be considered for the economist category. So before 2017, people would come in under the economist category and they would work in marketing, or they would work in market research analysis, essentially trying to find opportunities to generate profit for, say, investment firms. And the government in 2017 basically said, if someone is going to come into the US as an economist in the TN category, they need to closely do what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says economists should do. So again, we're going to Google that, OOH, economist, and we're going to see, what does the government think that an economist does? They research economic issues. They conduct surveys, collect data, they analyze data using mathematical models, statistical tools, and other software. They interpret and forecast trends, such as those of financial markets. They advise businesses, governments, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. So that is what you need to be doing if you're coming into the US in the economist category. And again, it's worth sitting down with the US employer and having a discussion with them and pointing them to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and saying, is there any way that for my job duties in this role to be closely aligned with those on the Occupational Outlook Handbook? Even if your role to some degree goes beyond those in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, that is okay, but the majority of your time needs to be spent doing those job duties that are aligned with the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And that is important for any position, but especially important for the economist role. So let's again touch on the TN application process. I've already talked about the major, really the only ways to apply. Port of entry, consulate, or within the US through USCIS. I don't want to spend too much time going over that again, but you see on your screen the what needs to be included in the application, as I said before, the job offer letter, supporting documentation showing proof of citizenship and that you satisfy the qualifications. Some ports of entry for Canadians, because they can apply at an airport or a land border crossing, some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So you can find online on the government's website, CBP, what ports of entry are recommended for first-time TN applicants. We always recommend that you call ahead and just have a conversation with them, letting them know when you plan to apply, to approach the border, or the airport, and if there are any specific procedures you need to be aware of. During COVID, when it was designated a pandemic and a health emergency by the US, certain ports of entry would have limited hours. So it's always good to check that, and it's quick and easy to do that. You just go to the CBP website and get the contact information there. For nationals of Mexico, you cannot apply at a port of entry. You must apply at a US consulate. To do that, first step is to file a DS-160, which is an online application form. You pay the visa application fee, schedule your biometrics and the appointment at the consulate, and you attend your TN interview. The interview is usually quite straightforward. Usually the questions that will come up are what is explained in the employer letter. Who is the employer? Why do they need someone in this role? Why are you qualified to fill the role? What will you be doing in the role? How long will you be employed for? How will you be compensated? How much will you be paid, etc. Again, make sure that the person who signed the employer letter has their phone with them at the time of your interview, because sometimes consular officers or border officers will pick up their phone, call, just to make sure that the letter is legitimate. Again, they do encounter fraud, and they are sensitive to that. As I mentioned before, nationals of Mexico can sometimes renew their TN visa by mail. You basically just submit the application and wait for the consulate to let you know if you qualify to do that. And again, both nationals of Mexico and Canada can apply from within the US through USCIS. The employer would file the form I-129 with the supporting documents. So some final tips and common TN visa pitfalls, and we're nearing the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, now is the time to send those in. As I said before, call ahead to the port of entry, especially if you're unfamiliar with the procedures. Ensure that the employer contact is available to answer a call if the government official calls. Bring your original diploma, bring your official transcripts, and an original signed version of the employer letter on the company's letterhead. I will also add, you see official transcripts on here. The reason why transcripts are sometimes helpful to include is, if you look at the qualifications, again, taking the example of accountants, they will accept a baccalaureate degree. One of the very common questions is, do I actually need a degree in that specific profession? So if you're applying as an accountant, for example, do you need to have a baccalaureate degree in accounting? Or could you have a degree in economics? The answer is that you can have a related degree. But if you are going to try to qualify based on a related degree, it is important to bring your official transcripts and show that you've taken coursework that qualifies you to work in that area. So if you're applying as an accountant, you have a degree in economics, you would want to show that you have taken classes in accounting. So bring your original transcripts, be ready to walk the officer through the specific courses you've taken. And ideally, the employer would include in their employer letter how you're qualified, and would talk about your transcript and the specific classes that you've taken. Again, that's usually if you have a related degree. And I'll also quickly add that this is something that we regularly do with our clients. When we're hired to prepare a TN visa application, we will oftentimes spend a lot of time on the employer letter. It really is at the heart of the TN visa application. And what goes into that letter is a close analysis of how the applicant qualifies. So we will actually go through the transcript and actually discuss your specific courses, your coursework, whether you wrote a thesis, whether you've done research in an area that's related to the area that's related to the profession. So again, or sorry, if we move to the fourth bullet, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa that requires a showing of non-immigrant intent. This is very important. The TN visa is not a green card. A green card leads to permanent residency. That is in contrast to a non-immigrant visa, which the TN visa is. A non-immigrant visa means that you are entering the US for a limited period of time and that you will leave the US when your visa expires or when your status in the US expires. So this usually doesn't come up in interviews for the TN visa unless you have been renewing your status or renewing your visa a number of times. So if you can renew your TN status or TN visa indefinitely, there is no limit to the period of time. But if you have been in the US, on 2 TN visas and you're going to renew for the third time, you might start getting questions about your intent to depart. And so you should be ready to provide documents that show that you've maintained ties in your home country, that you have a bank account in Mexico, that you own a home in Canada, or that you have family in either country. Be ready to explain that you do in fact intend to leave the US at the expiration of your status. Again, that usually doesn't come up unless you've been renewing for some time. And with that, I will move to questions. Jiyae, did any
Yeah,
questions come in?
we had some questions roll in. So one question related to the requirements that we were talking about, right? So there is one question about the signature on the employer letter. So there is a question, can the signature on the employer letter be a copy of the original letter signed when we are going through consular processing and not to the CBP? What will be your answer to that?
I would say to err on the side of caution and bring an original signed letter to the consulate. The exception is going to be if you apply at USCIS. USCIS will accept copies of signatures, but otherwise, bring the original. And that applies to consulates and that applies to ports of entry.
Yeah, thank you for the clarification. So what would be the process of changing employers? So once you're in the United States on a TN visa, how would somebody go about changing the employer?
Absolutely. So there are a couple ways to do this. If you're in the US in TN status and you get an opportunity to work for a new employer, you could either, if you're you basically can follow the same process as for the initial application. So if you're a national of Canada, you would prepare a TN application with the new employer, with a new employer letter, proof of how you qualify, all of the documentation that you need in the initial application. And you could leave the US and re-enter either through an airport or through a land crossing, and you would present your new TN application and receive TN status that way. If you're a national of Mexico, you can go back to the consulate and apply that way, following the same procedure as for the initial application. If you don't want to leave the US, you can apply to work with the new employer through USCIS. So the new employer would file a Form I-129 with all of the supporting documents, the employer letter, proof of your qualifications, and would basically apply for you to extend your TN status, but specifically with a new employer. And you would note that, well, the employer would note that on the I-129, and the new employer would sign the I-129. you would need to wait for USCIS to approve the application before starting with the new employer. Fortunately, the I-129 can be, you have the option of premium processing, which means that USCIS will adjudicate the application within 2 weeks of filing. So that's not a long delay. You could be working for the new employer within 2 weeks of applying. I'll just quickly add that the TN visa also allows concurrent employment. So you can be in the US on in TN status to work for more than one TN employer. So let's say you're working for a TN employer and another company comes to you and says, hey, we'd love to have you part-time. You can work for them part-time and TN status. You would need, again, to wait for USCIS to approve your application, but essentially the new employer would file an I-129 and would make clear that this is for concurrent employment. And so you would be working for two TN employers. The couple things to keep in mind, logistically, you want it to make sense. So, don't represent to the government that you're going to be working for two TN employers for 50 hours a week each, and they're located in different cities. It needs to make sense to the government. So if it's 25 hours and 25 hours and they're in the same area, that makes sense. TN status also allows part-time work. So whether you're working for one employer or concurrent employers, you can work part-time on a TN visa as well. And just to be clear, nationals of Mexico, for concurrent employment, you could apply at the consulate or through USCIS, as I described.
All right, we can move on to the next question. Thank you for that, Dustin. So what if my profession is not in the list of covered professions? So for example, someone has a job offer for a hotel renovation, but construction is not in the list. What would be my approach to that?
Yes, so construction jobs, I will just say at the start, it's going to be hard to get a TN visa to work in construction. But what you want to do is start by looking at your job duties. What will you actually be doing in the role? Is it actually, once you list out your roles, will you be supervising the job site? Will you be creating blueprints? Will you be essentially engaging in any engineering tasks, for example? And once you've defined the job duties, you would go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and the regulations, and you'd see if there are any professional titles in the regulations with job duties that are close to what you would be doing in the role. So just to take an example, let's say you're going down the list of TN professions and you see engineer. So the next thing you would do is go on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, type in engineer, what they do, and if the job duties are close to what you'd be doing and you qualify, an engineer needs a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a state or provincial license. If you satisfy those qualifications and your job duties are similar to what's in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you could arguably have a good case for a TN. But that's the process, is think about what your job duties are, go to the list of professions, see if there are any titles similar to what you'd be doing based on the job duties in the Occupational Outlook Handbook, and see if you can make a case for yourself. And it might require going back to your employer and saying, hey, to get a TN visa, I am going to need to have job duties more aligned with what an engineer does. And if the employer is willing to give you those job duties, you have an even stronger case.
Great. Thank you for that perspective. All right. So what about the dependents of a TN visa holder? So can a minor spouse and a child of a TN visa holder apply after the family has come to the US? So I'm assuming that this question is asking if the dependents can change status in the United States once they initially enter as visitors.
Yes, family members can change status to be dependents of the TN visa holder. So their status would be TD status, and they would apply through USCIS.
Great. And what about switching to a green card? So if somebody is already on a TN visa in the United States, can they change into a green card holder status if there is a relative or a spouse that can sponsor this person?
The answer is yes. So basically, the way the green card application process works in the US is you need to independently qualify for the green card. So, in other words, it does not help you or hurt you by having a TN visa. Basically, for everybody, you need to either have that family sponsorship or you need that employer sponsorship to apply for the green card. So, if you're in the US on a TN visa and your employer says, we'd love to have you here long term, we'd love to sponsor you for a green card, that is fine. You can go through that process. If you're in the US on a TN visa and a family member says, I want to apply for a green card for you, that's fine as well. The thing that's important to keep in mind is that the TN visa, again, is a non-immigrant visa. So you need to represent to the government really each time you apply for a TN visa or TN status, meaning each time you come into the US, that your intention is to leave and not adjust status. So if you have a pending green card application, especially an adjustment of status application, that could affect your chances of renewing your TN visa or you being admitted back into the US. So basically, what you want to do is make sure that you have time on your TN visa before you submit the green card application, and ideally process the immigrant visa at a consulate rather than adjusting status in the US. That way, if the government asks you, you're applying for an immigrant visa, why should I let you in on a non-immigrant visa? You can say to them that your consular processing, you're required to leave the US to get that. So your intention is not to adjust status and remain in the US.
All right, that was very helpful. So final question we have here is an educational evaluation like WES or IQAS required if I am going to the border to apply for a TN visa? I am a Canadian citizen. Do I need a US education equivalency report?
Very good question. You do not need an equivalency report if you went to school in a NAFTA country. So if your degree is from the US, Canada, or Mexico, you do not need an equivalency report. However, if your degree is from anywhere else, you do. So that would include the UK. If you have a degree from the London School of Economics, Oxford, Cambridge, it doesn't matter how prestigious these schools are, you do need an equivalency certificate.
Very helpful. So another question just popped up. What happens with my visa if I change and I'm assuming employer, can I go out and enter again with the visa for the first job if that job is no longer there?
So I'm trying to think through how this would happen in practice. So if you're in the US and let's say, so you receive an opportunity, you change employers in the US, and then you travel, you should be able to provide the USCIS approval to the border officer to show that you have changed employers. However, there are mixed results in practice with this because technically, Customs and Border Protection, the agency that admits people, is not allowed to adjudicate TN status, TN applications for nationals of Mexico. They are only allowed to adjudicate petitions for nationals of Canada. So there are many border officers who will not allow you to enter based on a USCIS approval. So if you do plan to travel, I would recommend, if you're a national of Mexico, that you try to get an approval at the consulate with the new employer, just to make sure you don't face issues at the border. For nationals of Canada, this should be a non-issue. because if you're in the US, you change employers, you would get that approval from USCIS, and then when you travel, you probably could be admitted based on the USCIS approval. But just to be safe, I would recommend bringing the application you submitted to USCIS, and then they could adjudicate it at the border as well. So it should not be an issue for nationals of Canada.
All right. So, how much is the fee to get the 4th-year visa? I think you
Yeah.
can look it up, right?
Yes. So basically, for any of these fees, you can search U.S. Department of State reciprocity, which is just the agreement the U.S. has with the foreign country. And when you click on your country, so if we go over to Mexico, and then we click on the title of the visa, you can see that the fee for a 4-year TN visa is $382. And the fee for a 12-month visa is $104. So those are your two options as a national of Mexico.
All right. So last question, and I'm thinking this is from a Canadian applicant. Can I bring all my household items with me to the border for a TN application? And I think I've heard this question before. Can I bring a U-Haul to the border? And then how would that affect your case? And I would say probably not a good idea, right? Because the TN visa, as Dustin mentioned, is a non-immigrant visa. And if it seems like you're permanently relocating to the US, it is possible that they will not approve the visa for that reason.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, in immigration, there's what the law says, and then there's optics. How does it look?
Yes.
And optics are important because border officers and consular officers have essentially complete discretion to approve or deny you. So even if you have the strongest application, if it looks like you're going to do something that the officer doesn't like, they can deny you. So, yeah, if the officer thinks this person is moving their entire home to the US, they have no intention of ever going back to Canada, they very well could deny your application. So be careful doing that. I would say take what's reasonable. You can buy stuff in the US, but so, don't rob yourself of things you need, but also maybe don't bring the moving truck.
Right. Okay. Oh, and we keep getting all these questions popping up.
Sure.
Dustin, you've been doing such a great job. Okay, so if the TN visa has expired, but the I-94 was extended per the employer, and if the border is crossed before the renewal, would entrance be allowed?
Yeah, so basically we have to look at this one. It's different from nationals of Mexico and Canada. So nationals of Mexico, basically, so let's look at the question. If a TN visa, the visa expired, I-94 was extended, border is crossed before renewal. Okay, so I assume that's visa renewal. If you're a national of Mexico, you need to have a valid TN visa to enter the US. You cannot enter the US if your visa's expired. That's critical. That's fundamental. So it doesn't matter if USCIS extended your status. If your visa has expired, you cannot re-enter the US. You need a valid visa if you're a national of Mexico. Nationals of Canada, because they can apply at a port of entry, let's say they extended their status, their I-94 is longer, they leave to travel, they should bring their application with them so that they can be issued TN status at the port of entry and then receive the 3 years of status. I do think, just in an abundance of caution, I would bring the application rather than just the USCIS approval, even though you may very well be allowed entry based on the USCIS approval alone. Because a TN application is usually so small, I would just bring that with you to be safe. But yeah, it's a good question.
All right, so I think that is all of the questions from the audience. Dustin, thank you so much for your time and expertise. I'm sure this has been very helpful for everyone, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And please keep an eye out for the links and the resources that we will be sending you.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Jiyae.